The day everything changed. Zyra was only a child when the skies of Valora turned red. She had always known her home as a peaceful place. The tall crystal trees sparkled under the twin suns, and the rivers flowed with golden water. Valora was a paradise, untouched by war. Until that day. It started with a deep rumble, a sound that came from the sky. Zyra looked up and saw dark shapes cutting through the clouds. Dozens of them. Huge warships blocking out the light. The ground trembled as explosions tore through the cities. The Droxians had come. They were a race of brutal conquerors, feared across the galaxy. Their massive armored soldiers stormed through the streets, capturing or killing anyone in their way. Zyra ran, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could. She needed to find her parents. She needed to get home. But home was gone. Her house was nothing but fire and rubble. The streets were filled with smoke. Valoran soldiers fought back, but they were outnumbered. Zyra's heart pounded as she ran down a narrow alley, her breath quick and shallow. And then she stopped. 3 Droxian warriors stood at the end of the alley, their glowing red eyes fixed on her. Their heavy, metal boots thudded as they stepped closer. One of them raised his weapon, a long black rifle that crackled with energy. Zyra froze. She couldn't move. Her whole body shook. The Droxian aimed. Then, bang! The Droxian fell. A single, clean shot to the head. His body hit the ground with a heavy thud. Zyra gasped. Someone was there. A tall figure stepped out of the shadows, holding a smoking gun. He wasn't Valoran. He wasn't Droxian. He was human. His face was covered in dirt and sweat. But his eyes, his sharp, determined eyes, locked onto Zyra. "Stay behind me," he ordered. She didn't question it. She ran to his side, gripping his jacket as the other 2 Droxians roared in anger. They charged forward. The human moved fast, faster than Zyra thought possible. He pulled out a second weapon, firing with both hands. 1 Droxian collapsed, sparks flying from his armor. The last one lunged at the human, swinging a massive blade. Zyra screamed. But the human dodged, twisting to the side. In one smooth motion, he pulled a knife from his belt and stabbed the Droxian in the throat. Silence. The battle was over. The human turned to Zyra, kneeling to her level. He looked at her, scanning for injuries. "You okay, kid?" he asked. She could only nod. "Where's your family?" Tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head. "Gone." The human's jaw tightened. He didn't ask more. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a small silver dog tag with strange markings. He placed it in her tiny hand. "Hold on to that," he said. She stared at the metal tag, confused. "Why?" "Because you're going to survive this," he said, standing up. "And one day, you'll find me." Before she could speak, he pulled her into a tight embrace. Zyra gripped his jacket, holding on as if he could stop the world from crumbling around her. Then he let go. "Run," he ordered. "Find a safe place. I'll hold them off." She wanted to protest. She wanted to stay with him. But the look in his eyes told her there was no time. So she ran. She didn't stop, even when she heard more explosions behind her. Even when she looked back and saw more Droxians swarming the alley where the human had stood. And then, he was gone. The invasion ended days later. The Valorans lost. Zyra was taken to a refugee planet, where she was told to forget the past, to start a new life. But she never forgot. She still had the dog tag, the only clue to the man who had saved her life. And one day, she would find him. The search begins. Zyra wasn't a little girl anymore, and she wasn't going to wait for fate to find him. Years passed. The scars of that terrible day on Valora never faded, but Zyra had grown stronger because of them. She was no longer the scared little girl hiding in the shadows of a burning city. She had become a tracker, one of the best in the galaxy, with a single mission: find the human who saved her life. She didn't even know his name, The dog tag he gave her was marked with strange symbols, written in the human language she couldn't understand. All she knew was the weight of that metal in her hand and the memory of his sharp, determined eyes as he told her to survive. But survival wasn't enough. Zira wanted answers. The galaxy was vast, filled with millions of planets and countless species. Humans were rare in this part of space. Some called them ghosts, wandering soldiers from a distant star system. Others believed they were just myths, stories told to scare children or inspire rebels. But Zara knew the truth. Humans were real. One of them had saved her life, and she was going to find him, even if it took the rest of her life. Zara leaned back in her seat as her small ship, the Starfire, cruised through the endless black of space. She stared at the dog tag, now worn smooth from years of holding it. The strange human letters gleamed faintly under the light. She had tried to translate them once, but the language was old, different from the galactic standard. That didn't stop her. Her latest lead had brought her to Draconis, a lawless outpost floating near the edge of known space. If there were rumors about humans, they would be here, in the dark corners where bounty hunters and smugglers traded secrets for credits. As the Starfire docked, Zira pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, hiding the silver glint of the dog tag. She stepped off the ship, blending into the crowd of rough-looking aliens and scruffy traders. The air smelled of metal, fuel, and something rotten. She made her way to the Rust Fang Tavern, a place known for information and danger. The moment she stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. Velerans were easy to spot with their glowing blue skin and bright eyes. But Zira didn't flinch. She walked straight to the bar and slammed a few plasma credits on the counter. "I'm looking for information," she said to the bartender, a bulky reptilian with sharp teeth. The bartender narrowed his eyes. "What kind of information?" She pulled the dog tag from her pocket, letting it dangle just enough for him to see. "A human," she whispered. "I need to find him." The bartender's eyes flicked to the tag, and for a moment, Zira saw something. Recognition, maybe fear, flash across his face, but he quickly covered it up with a sneer. "Haven't seen a human in years," he grunted. "You're wasting your time." Zira didn't move. Her voice dropped to a cold whisper. "I'm not leaving without answers." Before the bartender could reply, a gruff voice behind her spoke. "I might know something," it said. Zira turned slowly. A tall, shadowy figure leaned against the wall, his face hidden under a hood. She couldn't see his features, but the confidence in his voice told her he was no ordinary drifter. "Follow me," he said, pushing off the wall and heading toward the back door. Zira hesitated. It could be a trap, but she had come too far to back down now. She followed him into a dark alley behind the tavern. The sounds of the crowded outpost faded, replaced by the low hum of distant engines. The man stopped and turned to her. "You're looking for a human," he said, his voice low. "I've seen one, years ago, on a mining colony near Zephyrian 5. Zara's heart raced. What did he look like? The man chuckled, a deep, hollow sound. Tall, dark hair, eyes like ice. He didn't talk much, but he could handle himself in a fight. It sounded like him, but Zira needed more. "Do you know his name?" The man hesitated. "Ethan," he said finally. "I think his name was Ethan." Zira's breath caught in her throat. Ethan. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd ever had before. Before she could ask another question, the man's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. His other hand pulled a blaster from his belt, pressing it against her side. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered, "but you're asking the wrong questions." Zira's instincts kicked in. She twisted her body, breaking free of his grip. The blaster went off, the shot missing her by inches. She swung her fist, landing a punch to his jaw. The man staggered back, but he wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. It was a setup. Zira drew her own blaster, her mind racing. Why would someone try to stop her from finding Ethan? What was he hiding? The alley exploded into chaos as shots rang out. Zira ducked behind a crate, firing back at her attackers. She was outnumbered, but she wasn't going down without a fight. She had survived a Droxian invasion. She would survive this. As the last of her attackers fell to the ground, bleeding and groaning, Zara stood over the man who had lured her into the trap. "Who sent you?" she demanded, pressing her blaster to his forehead. The man coughed, blood trickling from his mouth. "You don't understand," he gasped. "You're not supposed to find him. He's dangerous." Zara's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life believing Ethan was a hero. But what if he wasn't? What if he was something else entirely? She stepped back, lowering her weapon. The man collapsed, unconscious. Zira stared at the dog tag in her hand. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. But one thing was certain. She was going to find Ethan. And when she did, she would learn the truth, no matter what it cost her. The dangerous clue. The name was scratched on a wall in a forgotten space station. Ethan was here. The cold void of space stretched endlessly as Zira's ship, the Starfire, glided through the blackness. Stars glittered like distant memories, each one holding secrets she might never uncover. But today felt different. For the first time in years, Zira had a solid lead, a name, a place, and a burning question. Ethan, the man who had saved her life, now a ghost she chased across the galaxy. Her latest clue had come from the dying breath of a bounty hunter on Draconis. Before slipping into unconsciousness, he'd whispered about an old, abandoned space station near the Kuras Belt, a place forgotten by time, a relic from a war long past. But most importantly, it was where Ethan had last been seen. Zira didn't know what she would find there. Maybe nothing. But she couldn't stop now. The Kuros Belt wasn't on any standard navigational maps. It was a graveyard of ships, debris fields, and rogue asteroids, known for swallowing travelers whole. But Zira was used to danger. She'd flown through worse. As the Starfire approached the coordinates, Zira's heart quickened. The space station drifted in the distance, a rusted, hollow giant, barely clinging to life. Its outer hull was cracked, panels missing, lights long dead. It was a ghost ship, forgotten by the galaxy, floating in silence. But Zira knew better. Silence in space could be the loudest warning. Docking with the station was tricky. The automated systems were offline, forcing Zira to maneuver manually. The ship hissed as it latched onto the station's outer airlock. She grabbed her blaster, holstered it at her side, and slipped the dog tag into her pocket. She took a deep breath and stepped into the dark. The station's interior was worse than she expected. The halls were twisted, metal walls scarred by past battles. Loose wires hummed like vines, sparking weakly, and the faint smell of burnt fuel clung to the stale air. Her boots echoed against the steel floor, each step reminding her how alone she was. But she wasn't afraid. Zira had faced worse than ghosts. She moved deeper into the station, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Old signs in faded human script pointed to long-abandoned sections: mess hall, living quarters, control room. She headed toward the living quarters, hoping to find any clue, any sign of Ethan. And that's when she saw it. A name scratched into the wall. The letters were rough, hurried, but unmistakable. Ethan was here. Zira's breath caught in her throat. It was real. He had been here. But why? And where was he now? She stepped closer, running her fingers over the jagged letters. It felt like a message, a trail left just for her. But before she could think more, a sound echoed through the hall. Footsteps. Zira spun around, blaster drawn. But the hall was empty. She strained her ears, listening. The footsteps were faint but steady, coming from deeper inside the station. She wasn't alone. Her heart pounded as she moved toward the sound, each step careful and quiet. Whoever was here, they didn't want to be found. But Zira was determined to find them first. She followed the noise to a large metal door, partially open, leading into what looked like an old command center. The room was dark, but faint lights flickered from broken consoles. Zira pressed herself against the wall, peering inside. That's when she saw them. 3 figures, cloaked in shadows, were huddled around a terminal. Their voices were low, but Zira could make out a few words. "The girl's getting too close. Ethan can't be found." Zira's pulse quickened. They knew her. They knew Ethan. She didn't hesitate. She burst into the room, blaster raised. "Who are you?" she shouted. "What do you know about Ethan?" The figures spun around, caught off guard. But they recovered quickly. One of them, a tall alien with gray skin and sharp, angular features, stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "You should have stayed away, little Velerin," he sneered. "You don't know what you're getting into." Zira didn't lower her weapon. "Where is he?" The alien laughed. "You think he's still the hero you remember? He's not. He's a traitor, a fugitive. And if you're smart, you'll forget about him." But Zira wasn't here to listen to threats. She fired. The blast hit the alien square in the chest, sending him crashing into the terminal. The other 2 lunged at her, but Zira was faster. She ducked under a wild swing, delivering a swift kick to one of them, sending him sprawling to the floor. The 3rd attacker wasn't so easy. He grabbed Zira's arm, twisting it painfully, trying to force her to drop the blaster. But Zira gritted her teeth and slammed her elbow into his ribs. The attacker grunted, loosening his grip just enough for Zira to break free. She fired again. The last attacker dropped, unconscious. Breathing hard, Zira surveyed the room. The terminal they had been using was still active, flickering weakly. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. The screen displayed a series of logs, most of them corrupted. But one stood out, a recent entry, marked only by a single line. "Stop looking for me, Zira. It's not safe." Her breath caught. It was his voice. Ethan. But why was he warning her? What wasn't safe? And more importantly, who was trying to stop her? Zira stared at the message, her mind racing. The man she had spent her whole life searching for was still out there. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous the truth became. One thing was clear: Ethan didn't want to be found. But Zira wasn't going to stop now. Not until she knew everything. The hidden truth. What if the hero I'm looking for is the villain of this story? Zira sat in the dim cockpit of the Starfire, the message replaying over and over in her mind. "Stop looking for me, Zira. It's not safe." The voice was unmistakable. It was Ethan, the human who had saved her life all those years ago. But his words weren't the comforting ones she'd imagined hearing when she finally found him. They were a warning, cold, distant, and full of something Zira hadn't expected. Fear. She stared at the worn dog tag in her hand, its surface smoothed by years of clutching it during sleepless nights. This small piece of metal had been her guiding star, a symbol of hope and gratitude. But now it felt heavier, as if the truth behind it was something she wasn't ready to face. Was Ethan really the hero she believed he was? Or was there something darker hidden behind those sharp, determined eyes she remembered? Zira shook off the doubt and fired up the ship's engines. She had one more lead. An old comrade of Ethan's, a man named Joran Vex, who was last seen on a mining colony called HFY. If anyone could give her answers, it was him. But answers came with a price. The journey to HFY was long and tense. Zira's mind raced with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. What if Ethan had changed? What if he had become the very thing she'd been fighting against all these years? But no matter how dark the truth was, Zira knew she had to face it. HFY wasn't much to look at. The planet was a dusty, barren rock, its surface scarred by years of mining and neglect. Massive drills loomed over the horizon, chewing into the ground like metal beasts. The colony itself was a cluster of rundown buildings, connected by narrow, winding paths coated in red dust. Zira docked the Starfire on the outskirts and made her way into the colony, her blaster hidden beneath her cloak. The air was thick with dust and tension, and the locals eyed her with suspicion. Velorans weren't common here, and outsiders were even less welcome. She found Joren Vex in a dim, smoke-filled bar called the Rust Maw. The place reeked of sweat and engine grease, and the low hum of conversation died the moment Zira stepped inside. But she didn't care. She spotted him immediately, a broad-shouldered man with a cybernetic eye, sitting alone in the corner, nursing a glass of something dark and toxic-looking. His face was weathered, marked by scars and years of hard living. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. One was cold and calculating, the other a glowing red orb that flickered with mechanical precision. Zira approached his table without hesitation. "Joren Vex?" she asked, her voice steady. The man looked up slowly, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on her. "Who's asking?" he growled. Zira pulled the dog tag from her pocket and dropped it onto the table with a soft clang. "I'm looking for Ethan," she said. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the bar's faulty lights. Then Joren chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "You're chasing ghosts, girl," he said, pushing the dog tag back toward her. "Ethan's gone. You're better off forgetting him." Zira didn't move. "I don't believe that. I know he's alive, and you're going to tell me what happened." Joren's eyes narrowed. "Why? What's he to you?" Zira hesitated, the memories flashing in her mind. Velora burning, Droxians closing in, and Ethan standing between her and certain death. "He saved my life," she said quietly. "I need to know why he disappeared." Joren stared at her for a long time, as if weighing her words. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You want the truth," he said. "Fine, but you're not going to like it." The truth was worse than Zira could have imagined. Joren told her everything. After saving Zira on Velora, Ethan returned to his unit, a specialized human task force operating in the shadows of intergalactic politics. But something had changed in him. He started asking questions, digging into the Droxian invasion of Velora. What he found shook him to his core. The invasion hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated, a setup. Certain factions within the human military had allowed the Droxians to attack Velora to gain political leverage in the galaxy. The deaths, the destruction, it had all been part of a larger plan to manipulate alliances and control trade routes. Ethan had tried to expose the truth, but the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. His superiors labeled him a traitor, accusing him of treason. When he refused to back down, they put a bounty on his head. He didn't desert because he was scared, Joren said, his voice low. He deserted because he saw the truth. And the truth made him a target. Zira's heart pounded in her chest. The man she'd been searching for wasn't just a hero. He was a fugitive, hunted by the very people he once served. "But why warn me?" she asked. "Why tell me to stop looking for him?" Joren leaned forward, his expression grim. "Because anyone who gets close to Ethan ends up dead. They don't just want him silenced. They want everyone connected to him gone. You're a loose end, girl. And loose ends don't last long in this galaxy." Zira felt the weight of his words, but she didn't back down. She had come too far to walk away now. "I don't care," she said firmly. "I'm going to find him. And when I do, we're going to expose the truth." Joren shook his head, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But guts won't keep you alive." Zira stood, slipping the dog tag back into her pocket. "I'll take my chances," she said. As she walked out of the Rust Maw, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, determination. The hero she'd been searching for was now a hunted man. But Zira wasn't going to let that stop her. She was going to find Ethan. And when she did, they would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. "You're chasing ghosts, girl," he said, pushing the dog tag back toward her. "Ethan's gone. You're better off forgetting him." Zira didn't move. "I don't believe that. I know he's alive. And you're going to tell me what happened." Joran's eyes narrowed. "Why? What's he to you?" Zira hesitated, the memories flashing in her mind. Velora burning, Droxians closing in, and Ethan standing between her and certain death. "He saved my life," she said quietly. "I need to know why he disappeared." Joran stared at her for a long time, as if weighing her words. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You want the truth," he said. "Fine, but you're not going to like it." The truth was worse than Zira could have imagined. Joran told her everything. After saking Zyra on Velora, Ethan returned to his unit, a specialized human task force operating in the shadows of intergalactic politics. But something had changed in him. He started asking questions, digging into the Droxian invasion of Velora. What he found shook him to his core. The invasion hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated, a setup. Certain factions within the human military had allowed the Droxians to attack Velora to gain political leverage in the galaxy. The deaths, the destruction, it had all been part of a larger plan to manipulate alliances and control trade routes. Ethan had tried to expose the truth, but the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. His superiors labeled him a traitor, accusing him of treason. When he refused to back down, they put a bounty on his head. He didn't desert because he was scared, Joran said, his voice low. He deserted because he saw the truth, and the truth made him a target. Zara's heart pounded in her chest. The man she'd been searching for wasn't just a hero. He was a fugitive, hunted by the very people he once served. "But why warn me?" she asked. "Why tell me to stop looking for him?" Joran leaned forward, his expression grim. "Because anyone who gets close to Ethan ends up dead. They don't just want him silenced. They want everyone connected to him gone. You're a loose end, girl. And loose ends don't last long in this galaxy." Zira felt the weight of his words, but she didn't back down. She had come too far to walk away now. "I don't care," she said firmly. "I'm going to find him. And when I do, we're going to expose the truth." Joran shook his head, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, "but guts won't keep you alive." Zira stood, slipping the dog tag back into her pocket. "I'll take my chances," she said. As she walked out of the rust maw, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, determination. The hero she'd been searching for was now a hunted man, but Zira wasn't going to let that stop her. She was going to find Ethan, and when she did, they would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The final battle. If they wanted Ethan, they'd have to go through Zyra first. The world outside the crumbling outpost on Zephyrian 5 exploded into chaos. The ground trembled as dropships roared overhead, their engines screaming against the rust-colored sky. Dust and debris filled the air as waves of armed soldiers poured from the ships, their weapons gleaming under the blood-red sun. Zara and Ethan stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs against the cracked metal walls of the outpost. The brief reunion they'd shared was now overshadowed by the grim reality of what was coming. They had been found. And this time, their enemies weren't just bounty hunters or mercenaries. These were elite soldiers, handpicked by the very leaders who had orchestrated Velora's destruction. They wanted Ethan silenced for good. But Zira wasn't about to let that happen. Inside the outpost, Ethan moved with calm precision, checking the ammunition in his rifle and setting up defensive barriers near the entrances. Zira could see the soldier in him, the same man who had saved her all those years ago. But this time, she wasn't the scared little girl hiding behind him. She was ready to fight. "Do you have a plan?" Zyra asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Ethan nodded, pulling out a holomap and projecting it onto the dusty wall. "They're surrounding us from 3 sides," he said. "But there's a weak point here, He pointed to a narrow canyon behind the outpost, hidden from view by a ridge. "If we can get past their perimeter, we can escape into the canyon and head toward the old communication relay. We'll need it to broadcast the evidence." Zira's eyes narrowed. "And what about them?" She jerked her thumb toward the growing noise outside, the sound of boots marching and weapons charging. Ethan's expression hardened. "We hold them off long enough to make our move." Zira nodded. She wasn't going to let him do this alone. The first wave of soldiers hit the outpost like a storm. Explosions rocked the walls as grenades detonated near the entrances. The metal structure groaned under the assault, but it held. For now. Zira crouched behind a barricade, her blaster gripped tightly in her hands. She could hear the soldiers shouting to each other in clipped military code. They moved like shadows, efficient and ruthless. But Zira was faster. As the first soldier burst through the doorway, she fired without hesitation. The blaster bolt struck him in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. Another followed, but Ethan was already there, his rifle barking with deadly precision. The outpost became a battleground, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. But Zira and Ethan fought with a determination that surprised even them. For every soldier that entered, 2 more fell. But they were outnumbered, and the enemy wasn't going to stop. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, Ethan grabbed Zira's arm, pulling her toward the back exit. "Now," he shouted over the noise, "we can't hold them much longer." Zira nodded, her heart racing. They sprinted through the narrow corridors, dodging falling debris and stray blaster fire. The outpost was collapsing around them, but they didn't look back. As they burst through the back door, the harsh sunlight blinded Zira for a moment. But there was no time to adjust. The canyon was just ahead, but so were more soldiers, waiting for them. "They've blocked the escape," Zira shouted. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then we make our own way." He threw a plasma grenade toward the nearest group of soldiers. The explosion lit up the sky, sending shockwaves through the ground. The soldiers scattered, and Ethan and Zira charged forward, using the confusion to their advantage. They sprinted into the canyon, blaster bolts whizzing past their heads. The rocky walls echoed with the sounds of battle, but they kept moving, their goal clear in their minds: the communication relay. It was their only chance to expose the truth, to reveal the conspiracy that had destroyed Valora and turned Ethan into a fugitive. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. As they neared the relay, a sharp pain shot through Zira's leg. She stumbled, falling to the ground with a cry of pain. "Zira." Ethan was at her side in an instant, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm fine," she gasped, gritting her teeth. "Just a graze." But Ethan could see the blood. He pulled her behind a large rock for cover, his hands shaking as he tried to assess the wound. "We don't have time for this," Zira said, her voice firm. "You need to go. Finish the mission." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." Zira grabbed his wrist, her eyes blazing with determination. "You saved me once," she whispered. "Let me return the favor. Go, Ethan. I'll cover you." For a moment, Ethan hesitated, but then he saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't the little girl he had saved on Valora. She was a warrior now, and she wasn't giving him a choice. With a nod, Ethan sprinted toward the relay, his figure disappearing into the dust and chaos. Zira took a deep breath, steadying her blaster. She could hear the soldiers closing in, their footsteps pounding against the rocky ground. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The final battle was fierce. Zira fought with everything she had, her blaster never missing its mark. The soldiers came in waves, but she held them off, buying Ethan the time he needed. In the distance, she saw a bright flash of light, the relay activating. A surge of hope filled her chest. Ethan had done it. The truth was out. But the battle wasn't over. As the last of her energy drained, Zira felt herself weakening. The wound in her leg throbbed, and her vision blurred. She knew she couldn't hold out much longer. But just as she thought it was over, a familiar figure appeared through the dust. Ethan. He was back, his rifle blazing as he fought his way to her. His eyes were wild with fear and determination. "Zara," he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. "I got you." Zara managed a weak smile. "Took you long enough." Ethan laughed, a sound filled with relief and gratitude. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the starfire as the remaining soldiers retreated. They had won. But at what cost? As the ship lifted off from Zephyrian 5, Zara stared out the window, her heart heavy with exhaustion and pride. The truth was out. The galaxy knew what had happened to Valora, but their fight wasn't over. She turned to Ethan, who sat beside her, his hand resting on hers. "We did it," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his eyes soft. "We did, but there's more to come." Zara smiled, her strength returning. "Then we'll face it together." Because in the end, they weren't just survivors. They were fighters. And their story was far from over. The stunning reunion. She spent years searching for him. Now, she'd risk everything to save him. The starfire hummed quietly as it drifted through the endless black of space. Inside, Zara lay on a makeshift medical cot, staring at the cracked ceiling panels, her mind replaying the chaos of Zephyrian 5 over and over. The pain in her leg was sharp, a constant reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. Not just the mission, but Ethan. She turned her head, glancing at the cockpit where Ethan sat. His silhouette was outlined by the faint glow of the ship's control panels, his face tense as he piloted the ship toward an unknown destination. They had exposed the truth, sent the data to the galaxy's most trusted media networks, but instead of bringing peace, it had only painted a bigger target on their backs. The galaxy was now on fire. The human leaders, desperate to suppress the information, had declared both of them enemies of the state. The Droxians, realizing their manipulation had been revealed, put a bounty so high that every bounty hunter and mercenary from one end of the galaxy to the other would be after them. Zara knew they couldn't run forever. But right now, Ethan was all she cared about. After days of evading patrols and bounty hunters, they found refuge on Draxel 7, a remote moon hidden in a nebula thick enough to scramble even the most advanced tracking systems. It wasn't much, just an abandoned mining facility carved into the moon's rocky surface, but it gave them time to breathe, to heal. Zara sat on the edge of a metal cot, watching as Ethan patched up his wounds in silence. The scars on his body were more than just from recent battles. They were the marks of a man who had been running from his past for far too long. She broke the silence. "You were ready to die back there," she said quietly. "Why?" Ethan paused, his hand stilling as he looked at her. For a moment, his eyes softened, the hard exterior cracking just enough for her to see the man she remembered from Valora. "Because I thought it was the only way to make things right," he admitted. "I thought if I exposed them, it wouldn't matter what happened to me after. But then you showed up." Zara's heart tightened. She had spent so many years searching for Ethan, believing he was the hero who had saved her. But now she realized he was more than that. He was human, flawed, broken, but still fighting. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed, sitting beside her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tag, the very same one he'd given her all those years ago. The metal gleamed faintly under the dim lights. "Now I realize that living means more than dying for a cause," he said softly, "because you reminded me what I was fighting for." Zara's eyes burned with unshed tears. She took the dog tag from his hand, feeling its weight, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like hope. But peace never lasted long. Their hideout on Draxel 7 didn't stay hidden. One night, as Zara drifted into a restless sleep, the shrill blare of the ship's alarm pierced through the silence. They'd been found. Zara jolted awake, her blaster already in her hand. Ethan was at the controls in an instant, his face pale but focused. "Proxian patrols," he muttered. "They must have tracked the data signal." Before Zira could respond, the ship shook violently as blaster fire rained down from above. The old mining facility's walls cracked under the pressure, debris falling like rain. Ethan turned to Zira, his eyes filled with the same determination she remembered from Valora. "I'll hold them off. You get to the ship." Zira's heart clenched. "I'm not leaving you." But Ethan was already moving, grabbing his rifle and heading toward the entrance of the facility where Droxian soldiers were breaking through. "Zira," he shouted over the chaos, "I need you to survive. That's how we win this." But Zira wasn't a scared child anymore. She followed him into the fray. The battle was brutal. Droxian soldiers flooded the facility, their heavy armor making them nearly impossible to take down. But Zira and Ethan fought like they were one, their movements perfectly synchronized. Years apart hadn't dulled the bond they'd formed on Valora. It had only made it stronger. But then, the worst happened. A Droxian sniper's shot rang out, and Zira watched in horror as Ethan crumpled to the ground, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark and fast. "Ethan!" she screamed, dropping to his side. His breathing was ragged, his face pale, but his eyes, those sharp, determined eyes, found hers. "You have to go," he whispered, his voice weak. "Finish this, for both of us." But Zira refused to let him go. With a surge of fury, Zira grabbed Ethan's rifle and turned on the remaining Droxians. She fought like a force of nature, every shot fueled by the years of pain, loss, and love she had carried. The Droxians fell one by one, but Zira didn't stop until the last of them lay lifeless on the cold metal floor. Then she rushed back to Ethan. "Stay with me," she whispered, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. "I didn't come all this way to lose you now." Ethan managed a weak smile. "You're stubborn, just like I remember." Zira laughed through her tears. "And you're going to live to see how stubborn I can be." Somehow, by sheer force of will, Zira managed to get Ethan back to the Starfire. The ship roared to life as she punched in the coordinates for the nearest medical outpost. She didn't care about the bounty hunters, the soldiers, or the galaxy that wanted them dead. All that mattered was keeping Ethan alive. The journey felt like an eternity. Zira sat beside Ethan, gripping his hand tightly, whispering stories from their past, from Valora. She reminded him of the day he saved her life, of the hope he gave her when everything else was lost. And slowly, as the stars blurred past the ship's windows, she felt his grip tighten in hers. He was still fighting. And so was she. Weeks later, after Ethan had recovered, and the galaxy had begun to react to the truth they had exposed, Zira stood with him on the observation deck of the Starfire, staring out at the endless stars. The bounty on their heads was still there. The galaxy was still dangerous. But for the first time in years, Zira felt at peace. She turned to Ethan, her heart full. "You saved me once," she said softly, "but I think we've saved each other now." Ethan smiled, slipping the dog tag back into her hand. "No," he whispered, "you saved me." As the ship drifted into the stars, Zira knew their story wasn't over. The galaxy still needed them. But whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together. Because in the vast, cold expanse of space, they had found something rare, something worth fighting for. They had found each other.